It's a year in which the COVID crisis has caused terrible death and devastation. But it's a testament to the report that its recommendations are as fresh and as relevant as ever. Which is why, my lords, the government's response, which seemed complacent at the time, seems even more inadequate now. And I hope, having time to reflect, the Minister will be able to provide a more optimistic account of the actions that the government are now prepared to take in response to the report. My lords, I also thank the Food Foundation for their important and continuing work on these issues. Of course, I'm aware that the government's default position is that these issues are being dealt with in the National Food Strategy report, which is due to be published shortly. But this doesn't mean that all the policy should be put on hold. And many of the proposals, both in this report and in Part 1 of the Dimbleby report published last year, were urgent in nature. They related to the aftermath of the COVID crisis and the need to address the health and poverty issues thrown up by the pandemic. As the Hungry for Change report says, quote, "The crisis has exposed the fragility of many people's economic situation and exacerbated many of the problems relating to the poverty, food insecurity and health inequalities," unquote. And as Henry Dimbleby said in the introduction to Part 1 of his report, quote, "These recommendations are urgent, specific and carefully targeted. In this period of acute crisis, they could save many thousands from hunger, illness and even death," unquote. So can I ask the Minister, what has happened to the more immediate pressing recommendations in these reports? Is it in fact the case, as Noble Baroness McIntosh suggested, that a response to the first part of Dimbleby has already been sent? Because if so, I think we would all like to see that. And I hope it isn't intended to leave all the issues to be addressed in the white paper promised 6 months after the second report, when action is needed now. In particular, I would highlight 3 issues which will not wait another year. Firstly, as the report points out, the issue of food insecurity is a consequence of poverty and the economic and social failures which sit behind it. The fact is that 11 years of government failure have left our country ill-prepared for a job and welfare crisis. A recent report from the Trestle Trust shows that 700,000 households used a food bank last year, with a 49% increase in children being supported via that route, and 95% of people being referred to the food banks being categorised as very deprived or destitute. Even before the pandemic, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that 2.4 million people were living in destitution, unable to afford the essentials to eat and keep warm. My lords, these underlying inequalities have now been thrown into sharp relief by COVID, with debt and destitution rising and the number of children living in poverty increasing by a third. And, as the report points out, you cannot address poverty and food insecurity separately. They are intrinsically linked. Clearly, my lords, the welfare system is broken, and I absolutely agree with the report's submission that the government should not be reliant on charitable food aid to plug the holes in the welfare system, a point also made very powerfully by my noble friend Baroness Lister. Which is why the recommendations in the report, which address the failings of universal credit, particularly addressing the 5-week wait, which puts people into debt from which they cannot recover, are so important. And it's why it's also important to extend the £20 uplift in universal credit, a policy which the government failed to support in a recent vote. And it's why we need a plan to address the fact that eating well and embracing the Eat Well guide is unrealistic for many low-income groups and financially out of reach for many. So I was very disappointed to see the government's response to these proposals, which is best described as, "Thank you, but no, we have no plans to address these issues." My lords, it symbolises a hardness and a cruelty at the heart of this government's thinking, which belies all the talk of levelling up, a point made very powerfully by my noble friend Lord Rooker. So I hope the Minister will be able to reassure the House that the links between poverty and poor diet are now better understood. that detailed monitoring and data collection of food insecurity will continue to take place, and that the link between universal credit and food bank use will be properly addressed. Secondly, my lords, the COVID experience illustrated starkly the role that school food played in supporting childhood healthy eating. The image of children going hungry when the schools were closed, and the heroic efforts of Marcus Rashford to get the government to continue funding lunchtime food is a standout feature of our experience in the last 12 months. All the evidence shows that good food is essential for learning, and all the talk of levelling up won't work if children are hungry. The free school meal system is increasingly excluding children who would previously be eligible. The Dimbleby report recommends expanding eligibility to every child from a household in receipt of universal credit. The existence of holiday hunger continues to blight us. Even now, the government is only proposing to feed children on free school meals for 16 of the 30 weekdays during the upcoming summer holidays. So, my lords, we need an urgent rethink of the system to ensure every child has a hot meal once a day, and that breakfast clubs and holiday activities have the funding to fill the void in demand. Again, the government's response on these issues was complacent at a time when poor children are being left behind in the education system, and indeed the resignation of Kevin Collins, the Education Recovery Commissioner, highlights a damning indictment of their meagre education catch-up plan. So I hope the Minister, in his response, can reassure the House that steps will be taken to ensure that access to good, nutritional school food for all will be part of a more ambitious and urgent catch-up plan. Thirdly, my lords, as the report points out, Public Health England have made a clear link between obesity and COVID, with a disproportionate number of patients in intensive care being categorised as morbidly obese. There is an urgent need to address diet-related ill health and the consequences for the individuals and for society. It is vital that we increase public understanding of what constitutes a healthy and sustainable diet. And we need to address the difficult but essential challenge of a nation eating less meat and more plant-based products, and how we can achieve that. The report makes some really important recommendations on the labelling of food, on advertising and promotion of food, on mandating maximum calories per portion, on action to reduce sugar and salt, and the voluntary and regulatory measures needed to underpin these changes. We need to be clear with industry that if they don't respond swiftly and comprehensively, then regulatory action will follow, including fiscal levers and levies where necessary. Although, as my noble friend Lord Whitty said, addressing this end with multinational manufacturers and retailers is a much more difficult challenge. But I am pleased in their response that the government acknowledge action needs to be taken. But as ever, their reliance on long consultations and even longer implementation dates does not reflect the urgency of the public health issues we now face. And the government's obesity strategy, published last year, is welcome as far as it goes. But that again needs to be underpinned with a degree of urgency, with targets and measurements of success to deliver a real shift towards healthy and sustainable diets. Finally, my lords, I'm conscious I've only been able to cover a small part of the more comprehensive report. We look forward to the publication of Part 2 of the National Food Strategy and the debate that will follow. I hope the government will give it the weight and seriousness which I am sure it will deserve. And I hope, as part of their response, they will feel able to follow up part of this report's recommendations, which is to establish an independent body analogous to the Committee on Climate Change, which would deliver the strategic oversight of the implementation of the National Food Strategy, which would indeed ensure a comprehensive change in eating habits and food policy, which the nation deserves.
Minister, Lord Bennion.
My Lords, I thank the Noble Lord Krebs for initiating this important debate.
And I thank all noble lords for their contributions today. And what is absolutely apparent from those members of his committee who spoke is the respect they have for him and his chairmanship of this. And it was so good to hear so many of the members of his committee contribute to our debate today. I'm grateful to those members for bringing forward such an interesting report, the Hungry for Change report. And I fully admit I have a difficulty here today, because I will irritate your lordships if I hide behind the publication of future documents such as the Dimbleby report and then the food strategy. But also, I will be wrong to preempt those reports by prejudging them by saying too much at this stage. So I hope your lordships will humour me that if I try and sail a middle course. As highlighted in the committee's comprehensive report, food should be a source of enjoyment, of good health and cultural expression, and it is paramount that our food system delivers safe, healthy and affordable food for everyone, regardless of where they live or how much they earn. My lords, this government is committed to ensuring that our food system is built on a sustainable and resilient agriculture sector, so that we and future generations can continue to access good, healthy and sustainable food. I will try and tackle as many of the points that have been raised in the debate. I apologise if I can't to everybody, but if I can't, I will try and write to them. The noble Lord Krebs raised a very important point, and I would just say, since the start of the pandemic, government departments have come together to coordinate support for the most vulnerable. For example, the Food for the Vulnerable Ministerial Task Force was set up a year ago to respond to some of the initial challenges of COVID-19 for a limited time with a defined remit. The task force membership spanned departments across government, including housing, communities and local government, work and pensions, and ministers from the devolved administrations. The task force was instrumental in putting in place support for the most vulnerable individuals, and that included 63 million for the local authority grant scheme delivered by DEFRA with support from local government department to enable local authorities to provide further support for individuals struggling to afford food and essential items. There was 10.5 million to the food redistributive fair share, 1.8 million to the COVID-19 emergency food redistribution scheme, 3.4 million to support individual charities through the food charity grant scheme, and much more. Of course, the billions that have been spent on measures such as furlough have, of course, supported family incomes and therefore contributed to tackling food poverty. The noble Baroness Parmenter raised a straightforward question, and I can assure her that DEFRA is working closely with departments across Whitehall, including the Department for Health and Social Care and for Public Health England. DEFRA has been feeding into discussions around the setting up of the Office of Health Promotion to develop a white paper when it is established, and as part of these discussions we're setting out a plan to ensure the food system is sustainable and affordable and supports industry and innovation and encourages healthy diets whilst protecting animal health and welfare. The government's food strategy white paper will cover the entire food system from farm to fork, building on work already underway in the Agricultural Act and Fisheries Act and the Environment Bill, as well as docking into wider government priorities, including Build Back Better, levelling up our net zero strategy and our obesity strategy, which I will come on to. Noble Lord Rooker made a powerful speech. He is a person who I respected when he was a minister, but I simply can't agree. It would be a very appalling situation if what he suggested was true, and I absolutely refute it, and I would not be part of such a government, and it was an extraordinary allegation, I believe, to make. Like everyone in this House, I welcome the Right Reverend Lord Centenary to his place here. I know he's returned, and I know that was a second maiden speech. I wish him a happy birthday, and I thought he made a very powerful speech. It was when he said it's not about us,
It's about us. It's not about me. The state does have a role. We often talk about big state versus small state, and there are times when many of us who lead comfortable lives don't want the state taking all our taxes and interfering with us. But if you're poor, if you can't afford to feed your children, you need loads of state. And it's about getting that balance right, and he was absolutely right to raise that point. The Noble Lord Whitty showed a great understanding, as we would all expect, of the food chain, and made that very important statistic that 40 times the amount of money spent on advertising is spent on confectionery than on fruit and veg. And to him and to others in this House, I would say, if you want to see the direction of travel that the government's going and why it has asked Henry Dimbleby to do this piece of work, look at Henry Dimbleby's TED talk. It's 9 minutes, and it's absolutely brilliant because it talks about the holistic nature of the problem we're seeking to achieve. My noble friend, Lord Hannan, gave us a history lesson. And I just say to him that I had the privilege of representing the seat of Newbury, which was lost to the Conservative Party in the free trade election of 1906, when there was a bit of negative campaigning by the Liberal candidate, I know it's hard to believe, that suggested that the sitting MP, Mr. Mount, said, Mr. Mount wants you to pay more for bread, because he was opposed to free trade. And Mr. Mount lost his seat, a factor that was well remembered by his great-grandson, David Cameron, and what made him so passionate about free trade. And he's right, but we have to do it in the right way. And we have to recognise the cost of bringing food from all over the world, not just in terms of what it costs individuals, but what it costs our planet. And we want to make sure that the government's policy about the standard of food that is produced is what is weighed in the balance as well. And my noble friend, Baroness Mackintosh, made a very important point about the crisis, I'd put it like that, between a lack of understanding about town and country, and it was a point well supported by Noble Lord Curry. And I would just say that if I wasn't here, if I hadn't accepted this job, I would be at home with 800 school children visiting my farm today, and I've left my wife in charge, so I will pay a price for that later. But Lord Curry made also a very important point about obesity, as did the Noble Baroness, my noble friend Baroness Saunderson, Baroness Ritchie, Baroness Osmore, Baroness Scott, and of course the opposition spokesman. So what I would say to Noble Lords is this. This year is the 30th anniversary of the first obesity strategy. Since then, there have been 14 government obesity strategies, introducing over 700 policies. But since then, we have worse health outcomes related to diet, we have worse physical activity, and we have worse mental health. 4 out of 5 death and disability causes are diet-related. This is, my lords, a social justice issue, and it was well made in the Centre for Social Justice report, a brilliant piece of work, was chaired by my noble friend Baroness Jenkin, that looked abroad, saw where success has achieved results in places like Amsterdam, and has fed through to an obesity strategy. By implementing our policies and seeing them as part of an exciting, evolving long-term policy plan to improve population health, this can be the time when we break the decades-long cycle of repeated policies of little meaningful change. This is the opportunity we have to really tackle this problem, and the government's obesity strategy is different from its predecessors, and it's one that, with our support, it will work. The Noble Baroness Bennett made a characteristically powerful speech, but I would say to her this, that in our changes to farming system that we are now able to do, we can encourage all sorts of different farming activities. Next week there's the Groundswell event, which is promoting regenerative farming. No longer are farmers going to be narrowly pathed down a route prescribed by the Common Agricultural Policy that has been disastrous for our ecosystems, for our health as well. And so this is an opportunity to get this right, and we're determined to do this. Baroness Scott made a very important point about levelling up within communities. As the Rural Affairs Minister, I take this really seriously. There are rural poor who are very often hidden from our eyes because they live in relatively affluent communities. She was actually right, absolutely right, to point out that levelling up is not something that is just north-south or geographically important, and that's why the government and the committees on which I sit are really important to make the point that we are looking for poverty wherever it exists, to tackle it and to end it. And yes, we do admit there is a problem. There is a problem when any single person is prevented from having a healthy diet out of poverty, and we are determined to tackle it. And to the Noble Baroness Jones, I would say yes, but there is an urgency, and the interim report that Henry Dimbleby wrote was responded to by the Secretary of State, but we will respond more fully as his main report is published, and we will keep the House informed about that. My Lords, tackling poverty in all its forms is a key priority of this government, which includes ensuring everyone has access to food. And during the last year, significant support has been given to the economically vulnerable as part of the government's COVID-19 response. As I've stated earlier, this has included a number of things, including increasing the value of Healthy Start vouchers, the national rollout of the holiday activities and food programme, COVID support grants through local authorities, and direct funding to support